Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever it is that you are and wherever you may be. Thank you very much for making us a part of your day. I am Brad Franklin, a creative content writer here in Chesterfield, and I'm very glad to tell you that Chesterfield Behind the Mic is on the air once again. Now, as you can tell, we are not in the friendly confines of our studio back in the administration building. No, we are out here at Manchester High School where it all began. We figured for our anniversary episode, let's go back to where it started, which is our very first episode we filmed down here talking Chesterfield Little League, talking about the Little League World Series, and we thought a year in, let's go and look back. We'll take you through how this idea became an actual production. We'll give you a behind-the-scenes look along the way, and we'll talk to some folks who are very involved in this process. We'll start with Susan Pollard, who is the Director of Communications Media, and she'll talk to you about that idea and how for years it sat as an idea and then eventually became an actual production, which we are extremely excited and extremely proud of 1 year in. We're joined now by Susan Pollard, who is the Director of Communications and Media. Susan, how are you?
Just fine. Thank you for having me, Brad.
I'm very glad to have you. Obviously, we can't do an anniversary show without the story of the show. It would be a little bit weird to try and do that.
Yes, and I cannot believe it's been a year. Can you believe that?
It's been
a full year.
It has, and it's funny because like looking back on it as we've been planning this thing out, it feels like, oh yeah, we did do that. Oh yeah, we did do that. Oh yeah, we did it. So 29 episodes all told. But I want to kind of go back a little bit and talk a little about sort of the idea itself and when it originally sort of started percolating and how that kind of worked itself out. And I'm just curious, what's your earliest memory of talking about the department bringing a podcast to fruition?
I would have to say at least 5 years ago.
Wow.
And that's at the very least. We've been really talking about podcast and blogs and newsletters and video series,
right.
You name it. We've been talking about those communications tools to reach our audiences. And the video podcast is just another tool, a very important tool that goes into that communications toolbox that so many people talk about. In terms of reaching out to our residents and connecting with our citizens and engaging, interacting, informing, and all of those important things, the video podcast plays a very, very important role. And so we talked about it, like I said, more than 5 years ago, and we had it as that on that list of things that we need to do.
Right.
We want to do.
Right.
And we want to provide this other new way of connecting with the residents of Chesterfield. And so again, like I said, I can't believe it's been a year that we've had this out. But there's a lot of things that go into play when you do it. You can't just suddenly set up a podcast. Well, you could, but
you might not want to.
You might not want to. But to really do it right. To make sure that it's ready for the citizens, to make sure that it's answering those questions and connecting with the residents appropriately and on the topics that they're interested in, the topics that they need to know and to engage. And then, of course, the resources involved.
Right.
So it does take a while to get to that point, but I think that the video podcast we have today is really a sum of all that work that went into it behind the scenes, because there's a lot that goes into it.
Yeah, for sure. I'm curious too, as you sort of look back on this entire process, as you look back on these last 5+ years, what kind of I don't know, how would you sort of describe the way that this thing really came together and really sort of did come to fruition?
Well, it was a process because there were many things that needed to kind of come together before we could just launch a video podcast. And that included not only the equipment, but also the people. Having very highly talented people such as yourself and our production team that people don't see, but they really actually get to reap the rewards of the hard work of the people behind the scenes that make this video podcast possible. And then, of course, moving forward, structuring that content. What does that editorial content look like? I think, too, when we were putting this together, this was something that, again, it's been on the horizon for a long time. COVID hit. We had to restructure some things and then put together a new approach to be able to launch the video podcast. And the support of the board, the support of the administration, and they their desire to make sure that we connect with residents, that we're engaging, that we're communicating with residents, really helped drive that process even further, and really has brought us the success that we really experienced today, a year later.
That's right.
So it's been, I think, an incredible journey for Chesterfield in terms of telling people about local government, sharing information about local government in that conversational way. Sometimes also sharing some more complex projects and programs that sometimes you just don't have time for in other mediums, because you're not going to get that full story in a, on a TV news channel, or you're not really going to get the full story on a quick social media, post. But here you can have that conversation. You can hear those questions that you ask, that you talk to the person about, and you're able to really discern more about what the project or the program. So that's what video podcast really brings. And I think having just the support of Chesterfield County's board, administration, and the department's involvement is really what it's about. And it's another communications tool that we definitely want to keep going. And I think that our team here has already shown that our first year is just the beginning of even more great things to come.
Absolutely. Well, Susan, thank you very much for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I want to thank Susan for taking the time and talking with us about launching the podcast. As you can see, I'm no longer in the studio. We're at the ball field. Here I am in Central Library, which was the site of one of the other podcasts we've done, where we talked with some kids who do robotics here in the makerspace. And the relationship that we have with not just the other departments, but also with the people of Chesterfield helps us as we have gone through this first year. And that relationship is essential to what we do in terms of telling the story and bringing the information to folks. We're going to talk next with Theresa Bonifas, who is the Digital and Media Relations Manager for our department, about not just that partnership and why it's so essential in terms of the topics we pick and how the podcast comes to be, but also why it's essential in terms of the way that we communicate with the residents of Chesterfield County. Teresa, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Good. How are you? Thanks, Brad.
I'm good. I'm glad to finally have you on this side of the camera, which is going to be a theme for folks who are watching this. Before we get really deep into it, Susan talked a little bit about sort of the years of this being an idea and how this thing sort of came to fruition. And I'd like to get sort of your point of view on sort of what that process was like and what you remember about sort of how this thing went from being an idea to being a full-blown actual thing that's out in the world.
Sure, yeah. Susan and I have talked about a podcast for a long time. It's been something that's been on the list. We finally got the resources. And so, one thing that's different about most podcasts is most people think podcasts are audio. Ours is audio and video. So that was a whole nother aspect.
I'm still okay if y'all want to make it audio only.
I'm sure you are, right? So with that, we wanted to make sure when we did it right. So when we got the resources we needed, it was a no-brainer. Let's do this. And the podcast really allows us to tell Chesterfield's story in another way. There are so many stories to tell. And so really, we wanted to meet people where they were. And really come into Chesterfield's home. We wanted Chesterfield to come into your home, and whether it was your commute or whatever, we knew that the podcast space was somewhere where we were lacking, and we really wanted to be there.
Now, in terms of, for folks who don't watch to the very end, you are one of the executive producers on the show, and I can imagine that from your seat, because it certainly is like that for the rest of us too, right? Where it's like one of the downsides to having a successful show is that everybody wants to be on it. And I'm curious about the topics and how you see sort of your role in the bigger picture of things with the department in terms of picking those topics and how tough a process it is to do that.
Yes, the topics. That is one of the downfalls of a successful podcast, for sure, is everybody wants to be on it. We get requests. I think if I'm not in a meeting where somebody says, "Oh, can we do a podcast on this?" It's very rare, let's put it that way. But one of the things when we started this podcast and we went through this process and we were outlining our editorial calendar, we really wanted to be sure that the podcast had a good mix of government topics as well as those community topics. And I think we've done a pretty good job at it so far. We're going to continue to do that if we can tell a few more those community stories, that'd be great.
Right.
But, you know, it kind of goes back to the purpose of Chesterfield Behind the Mic of, you know, telling that story, meeting people where they are, informing them of not only the great things that are going on in the county and the government space, you know, from all the government topics that we've done and the departments. There's so many things. The county, our departments do so many great things that a lot of people may not even know about. And that's what's so important about this, but also telling the side of maybe it's a neighbor, a friend, you know, community member. Those stories are just as important. And the podcast gives us that opportunity to do that. So I don't think there'll be a shortage of topics. No. We got a long list, but that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah. Now, in terms of, you know, when we talk about communications, you know, obviously it's the communications and media department, and communicating is so central to what we do. And sometimes we talk about communications and then we talk about like the big C communications, which in that, what I mean by that is like the idea, sort of the methodology behind sort of like the science of how you communicate to people. And the podcast is certainly a different sort of tool, but it's only one of many tools. And I'm curious if you can speak to sort of the way that the podcast fits in the larger structure of the department and how important basically finding those different ways to communicate really is to communications in general.
Sure. So we look at the podcast as just another tool in our toolbox, a very effective tool, actually. But when we are putting together a campaign or we're looking at, you know, information and how we want to present that, the podcast is definitely a tool in that toolbox we like to use. I think a really good example that sort of showcases this is the accidental drug dealer campaign. I know Allison Butler was on this show a few months back, and the podcast allowed her to tell more of the story than probably we could tell. For example, you know, that particular campaign, we sent out a news release, we did social media, we did paid ads, we did media pitches, but the podcast allowed us to really tell a longer story and the full story for people to get down and dirty, for lack of a better term, into some of the details. You know, a newspaper article is only going to be but so long.
And there's only but so much context.
A TV station, if they do a story, you're looking at a minute and a half, 2 minutes. But for us to be able to talk about the importance of safe storage and disposal, and then to go into some of the stats and you know, reasons why this is such an important campaign, and then even show people or tell people how to use the bags and where to get them. So I think, you know, again, that was one tool, one medium that really fit the podcast. And kind of going back to the topics, you know, that's one of the things we really look for when determining topics is the podcast the right medium?
Does it make sense, for that medium? And then too, at the same time, because not only does the podcast give us the opportunity to put people, you know, to give people that information and that context and sort of that deeper, as Susan referenced, you know, that sort of an intimate conversation. But it also allows sort of us to sort of invite people in and see what we do. And I can imagine, you know, as we wrap up here, that is also, again, as somebody who is not just an executive producer on this show, but also because of, you know, your role in the department, that's also, you know, fits into the bigger picture as well, which is to basically, it's not just an opportunity for us to talk to folks out there to share that information, but it's also an opportunity for them to see different parts of the county.
Exactly. Yeah. We're, you know, one of the great things about the podcast, and it even being visual as well, which is one of the benefits, is, you know, the topics get a name, they get a face, they get a voice. We have so many content experts in the county from the different departments, and really those people are able to show why they are those content experts and, you know, present those points or that information, you know, from pulse point to maybe it's parking regulations. You know, these are stories and things that everyone in the county, you know, should know about. And the podcast allows us to not only tell that story, but then give that name, that face to it. And I think that's one of the huge benefits to Chesterfield Behind the Mic, because, you know, we're able to come into your home and you're able to see it's not just us talking. It's kind of that validation of it's coming from the source.
Good deal. Well, Teresa, thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I want to thank Teresa for her time and coming on the podcast and talking to us about the context that the podcast allows in terms of communicating things and why it's so essential when we look at the different topics that we choose, why the podcast is right for this and why it might not be right for that, and the way it fits into the bigger picture of what communications and media tries to do. Our third and final segment of the podcast, as we look back on this first year, is a really fun one for me because I could not do this show. This show could not happen if it wasn't for Martin Stith and Matt Boyce, who are on the production side of things. This is a golden opportunity for us to put people who are always behind the camera in front of the camera, and I'm really, really happy with the way this turned out as we look back on the first year and launching this thing. So let's take a look. We're joined now by good friends of mine, Martin Stith and Matt Boyce. Members of the production team, members of the podcast team. How's it going, guys? Welcome to the show.
Good.
I know that this is a little bit different for you guys to be in front of the camera, so I appreciate you giving me a few minutes, but I just wanted to kind of bring you on and talk a little about sort of launching this thing and what it was like to do it away from the confines of the studio, to do it, at the field. And what do you remember about those early conversations about launching a podcast? What were those early meetings and those conversations like before we launched it?
Well, for us, it was a lot of like getting the equipment together, deciding,
right.
What would be the best equipment to get it done, what we needed. And we had all kind of focused on doing it here in the studio. And
right.
so that had kind of been our big focus of making sure the studio space was right. And then
Little League World Series.
Right. At the last minute, it's like, hey, let's do the very first one out on a baseball field.
Which I'm pretty sure was my idea, so my apologies in a year later.
It ended up working great. But of course, in the first meeting when that comes up, it's like, what?
Oh, yeah.
Are we crazy? Like,
right.
why are we going the first time and going out on this field?
Right.
So, we had to, we had to go out there and we had
see if they had power.
Make sure they had power. We had to go out and see where the sun was going to be at that time of the day, which way we wanted to set it up.
Right.
How are we going to, but, actually, when we got out there and got it all set up, it really didn't take that long, and it all went really smoothly.
Right.
I mean, that thing could have crashed and burned in a heartbeat, right? But I mean, it like went off without a hitch.
Yeah.
So
I remember the night before we recorded it being extremely nervous, but in a way that didn't make any sense, right? Like it wasn't like we were all going to forget how to do the thing. If we ran into speed bumps or whatever, we'd figure it out. But I do remember that night before being super stressed. Martin, what was that? What were those first conversations and launching it like for you?
I remember the meetings. We had several meetings, and I will say we were put in a position for success. It was just a matter of doing it.
Right.
We're going outside to do our very first podcast. I'm like, okay. But like Matt said, it really turned out well.
Yeah, it did.
I couldn't ask for a better situation.
It took us I want to say like no time at all from like once we actually started recording the thing to sort of get into that flow and the episodes and what kind of goes into it from y'all's point of view of balancing everything? Because, for me, the podcast is the biggest production thing I do, right? But you guys have so much else that you do, right? You're involved in a whole lot of video shoots, there are meetings to record. There's a lot else going on, right? There's stuff you got to go out and do. I'm just curious, like from a balancing side of things, how hard was it to then put the podcast in a spot and then keep all the other, plates in the air?
Yeah, it actually wasn't that difficult because, we had a lot of the equipment independent was just for the podcast. We have a couple pieces here and there that we use for other things too. But this setup predominantly is only for the podcast. Mm-hmm. So, taking it out to the baseball field or to the library or other places where we've done remote broadcast has not been that difficult because it's just kind of packing it up and getting it there and setting it all up. And so from a production standpoint, it's not that hard.
Right.
And in the studio here, it's great because everything's kind of already all set up.
Right.
We may take a piece of equipment here and there to do other things, but most of it is pretty podcast dedicated.
Right. And I want to mention here that for folks who may not be aware that the county uses this space for like a host of things, right? And so it's very common that we have to break all this down and put it back up. And the two guys you're seeing on screen right now, they're the ones who predominantly do a lot of that. Yeah, sure, I might be in charge of the board or whatever, but all of the stuff around here that you're getting a chance to see in this segment for the first time, like they're the ones doing a lot of that. And I can imagine as, when it comes to breaking it down and putting it back up, that there's there's just sort of like where does this go? It takes a little while, I guess, for you to get sort of into the rhythm. And it made me think of the Carrie Brockwell podcast that we did, right? Where that was something that was completely different than anything we had done to that point, right? Where we have multiple microphones and we have, we were using different angles and stuff. And I know that was one, at least for me, as I look back on the shows we've done, especially the ones that have that sort of community focus, that really stands out because it was one where, you know, we had a different challenge, right? We were not just capturing just really good video and a good conversation. We knew that there was going to be a musical component. And how do we make that sort of work when we hadn't done that? And I mean, go back and watch that thing, listen to that thing. It sounds incredible. And I think that's a lot to do with because of both of you guys and your experiences and your expertise. And I look back on it and it kind of astonishes me how good that podcast turned out. And I'm just curious what your memories are. Martin, let's start with you. What are your memories of that Carrie Brockwell podcast?
Carrie was excellent.
Yeah, she was great, right?
She was excellent. She spoke up. She was bubbly, lively.
So much energy. And she had come here from school, which I still think is just ridiculous.
Yes. Honestly, I was amazed. Yeah. I didn't really realize how much of a talent she was.
Right.
Very professional. But yeah, we had to rearrange the studio and camera angles.
Right.
And Matt and I went back and forth about, okay, what's the best angle to do this? And we did it all in one take, and it looked really, really good. I'm very happy with it.
Yeah. And she sounded incredible. I mean, I'm pretty sure that, you know, I don't know if you came into the studio that day with a blueprint, like in your head of like, okay, I'm going to put a mic here and do that. Or if it all happened sort of, but I just remember that day, you being like a man on a mission. Like you were very focused. You knew exactly what you wanted to do and how you wanted to set it up. And I just think that it came out really great.
Yeah, I thought it came out really good too, and part of that, like Martin said, was Carrie's energy. She brought a really great energy to that show, and really I think it really came through. But yeah, I definitely did kind of have an idea. I mean, just like anything in life, you get these kind of extra challenges sometimes, and it's kind of fun. At least I think it is sometimes to figure out how you're going to attack that challenge, and what you're going to do to kind of get through that. And so I did kind of have an idea of, you know, hey, I want to use this microphone and I want to have, you know, so we could pick up the guitar sound and we could get her singing and not have one or the other overpower it. And, you know, we've got all these great cameras that we use. So, yeah, let's not just put a camera on her and stick there. Let's, you know, we'll put a tight shot on her fingers playing the guitar and make it a little more visually stimulating, you know, for the people that are watching.
Yeah.
So, yeah, when you get those kind of production challenges, it's kind of fun to kind of think through, okay, well, maybe we can do it this way. And hey, it doesn't always work. That day it did, you know, but not always.
Yeah, that's true. Speaking of days that it worked, the Jailhouse Redemption show we did with the sheriff and the folks from the documentary, going to the Perkinson Center, which is such a great venue, right, was my first time in the building when we went and we did the walkthrough. I just remember thinking, like, this is a lot more space. I mean, again, to folks who are watching, and if you're listening, I can't describe for you just kind of how tight it can feel in this studio. So we go to the Perkinson Center, and it's just vast. I mean, there's just so much space. And I was curious, looking back on that one, what kind of stands out about that? Because to me, the Perkinson Center presented a different range of challenges, which is, you know, granted they have a production, you know, stage, so there's lighting and stuff, but how's it going to look and where the camera angle is going to be. And then you had the piece of, you know, you've got multiple folks coming in and out. I'm just curious as you look back on that one, to either one of you, what stands out about being there?
Well, that one I was really excited about because actually when they first opened the Perkinson Center, I did shoot some interviews on that stage using their stage lighting and the kind of the seats and the whole theater as a backdrop, and the interviews looked amazing. So I knew we had potential there to make this look really good.
Right.
So I was excited about that one, and not to get too technical, but my big idea for that one was on kind of the wide shot camera, we put a wide angle lens. So that shot really kind of gave you that scope that you're talking about of, you know, how big of a space we were in.
Right.
Because I think the cameras kind of fool people a little bit sometimes. Yeah. I mean, I know when I bring people in here, when we're not recording the podcast and it's set up in the studio and they go, oh, wow, this is a lot smaller than I thought it was. You know, because I think the cameras kind of give people who are watching like a sense that we're in a bigger space than we are.
Right.
But that one we really were, like you say, in a big space. So I think that wide angle lens on the wide shot camera really kind of opened that shot up and gave people kind of a sense of that space we were in.
Right. Martin, what do you think? What do you remember about being there at the Perkinson Center?
Well, Matt nailed it on the head, but I will say I think we'll be remiss if we don't thank John Shelley, who made it possible for us. He adjusted lights and everything and been very instrumental. Whenever we needed assistance from the Perkinson Center, he's been very accommodating.
Yeah. Good deal. Well, guys, thank you very much for giving me a few minutes today and coming on the podcast and celebrating this 1 year anniversary. We could not do what we do if it wasn't for y'all. And I just want to make sure you get those props, and you absolutely deserve them. So I very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What a fantastic first year we've had, and what a fun time it's been to look back over year one and get to talk about how this project came to be and the way things have gone, and what a better venue, right, than this amazing theater here at the Perkins Center, which was the site for one of my favorite episodes of the show we've done so far, but is also such an absolute gift for Chesterfield. I'm so glad to be back here today. I've had a really great time doing this anniversary show and looking back. How about you, Susan?
Brad, it really has been fabulous. It has been so much fun to look back at the past year, and it's hard to believe it's been a year. But there really have been so many wonderful people that have been responsible for the launch of this video podcast and its first year on air. You've gotten to see many of them throughout this special episode, but I do just want to take a second to once again thank them for their tireless efforts, for the work that they did and continue to do, and for the way that they serve the people of Chesterfield. From Martin and Matt on the video production side, behind the camera, to Brad as the host, to Teresa and everyone else in our communications and media department who work on this project. And also to the Board of Supervisors and the administration for not only being confident that we could and would make this idea a reality, but also the support that they've shown in making this possible. We could not do what we do without the team we have. And we are extremely thankful that we get this opportunity to do what we love, which is telling the stories of Chesterfield. It's the people who make this community so great. And we are so thankful that we are here telling stories and being a part of it. The video podcast is just one of a number of tools that we use to achieve that goal. And we are so proud of what we've accomplished. So here is to many more years ahead, Brad.
Absolutely. And what a great anniversary show it's been. So, from all of us here in Chesterfield, thank you very much for making us a part of your day. We'll see you again real soon. Take good care.